My name was the first thing taken from me, and the most painful. Before the diamond rings Richard gave me as a symbol of possession, I mistook for love. Before the red-soled shoes that echoed on the marble floors of our silent house. Even before the small photograph of my daughter I tried, futilely, to conceal in the hollow of my hand as if it were a sacred ember. The name my father gave me, whispered with pride on the day I was born, the same name my husband turned into a brand, a lustrous echo in ballrooms and gala dinners, was now just verbal garbage, an empty shell. Inside, I am a number, 734. A set of cold, harsh digits recited in a morning countdown that sounds like the creak of metal against metal. A sound that belongs to no one and at the same time belongs to all of us. The first night in this cell was a plunge into a different kind of darkness, a palpable darkness, smelling of disinfectant and ancient fear. The silence here is heavy, concrete texture and despair. No, it wasn't the absence of sound that frightened me. Prison is never truly silent. There was the rhythmic torture of a dripping faucet at the end of the hallway, the dry, ghostly cough of a woman in the next cell, the incessant electric hum of the lights that never truly go out. It was the silence of the soul, the sound of the absolute void where an entire life, an entire identity, used to flourish. I pressed my face against the cold wall, searching for a grain of familiarity, an imperfection that would connect me to the world outside, but everything was smooth, impersonal, polished by countless stories of loss and designed to erase individuality until only regret and time remained. In that darkness, I did something that felt like an act of pure insanity and the only sane thing to do. I leaned forward and, as quietly as I could, whispered my own name only to feel it die in the air. Genevieve. The acoustics of the cell swallowed him up without a trace. That's when I realized they thought they'd buried me. But there was something they hadn't anticipated. This institutional silence is, in itself, a weapon. Outside, on Fifth Avenue, silence was a choice, a luxury money could buy. I could seek it in our meticulously landscaped garden, an oasis of calm amidst the chaos of New York. Here, silence is imposed. It's the absence of your own voice, your own choices, your own thoughts. In the early hours, I found myself repeating my name in my mind, Genevieve, 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 like a mantra, to reassure myself that it still existed somewhere within me. But the sound of the gates closing became the brutal punctuation of every moment, the final point of every fleeting hope. It's a definitive sound, sealing not just a physical space, but a destiny. Time, that entity I once managed with a leather diary bearing my initials in gold, has now become an amorphous and sticky enemy. It doesn't pass. It pours over you, a slow, cold puddle that threatens to drown you. It was in this deafening silence, in this temporal distortion, that clarity began to emerge. And it wasn't a gentle, illuminating clarity. It was painful and sharp as a shard of glass. I wasn't just in a cell. I was at the epicenter of a perfectly constructed lie, a posthumous trap. And the only way out was through words. It was for you, my little Lily, that the decision blossomed amidst the panic. That first night, fear was a living creature, crawling through the cracks in the metal door, a visceral fear that their narrative, that of the Black Widow of Fifth Avenue, as the tabloids were already screaming, would become your truth. The fear that you would grow up believing your mother was the villain in a macabre fairy tale. It was then, with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, I made a promise. A promise to your image. A promise I kept in my memory. These wouldn't be just letters. They would be the bricks of a new house, a house made of truth that I would build for you here in the middle of this concrete desert. They would be the only bridge across an abyss of lies. A silken rope spun with the ink of honesty, which I would cast across the darkness that separated us. One day, I prayed, with a faith I didn't know I possessed, you would be big enough to pull this rope and meet me on the other side. Not as the monster they painted, but as the mother who loved you enough to turn pain into testimony. This prison would not be my tomb. No, it would be my confessional. And my quest for justice, my silent war, would begin with the first word written to you, a small, stubborn seed of faith planted in the deepest darkness. They called me a monster with practiced cruel eloquence. The prosecutor, a man with a stern face and an expensive suit that seemed carved with ambition, painted a portrait of me with the broad brushstrokes of greed and calculating cruelty. I was described as a bored socialite, an unfaithful wife who traded the love of a good man for his vast fortune and the freedom to live a life of excess. I vividly remember looking at the anonymous faces of the jury, desperately searching for a single glimmer of doubt, a flicker of curiosity beyond the facade presented to them. But they only saw what they were instructed to see. The magazine covers where my smile was a mask of perfection, the glitter of the diamonds at my neck, the image of a life so far removed from theirs that it could only be corrupted. The betrayal was not Richard's alone. It was the justice systems which chose the simplest, most sensational story. No one bothered to look at the shadows cast by that life of blinding light. No one saw the nights when the absence of sound in our home was the cruelest of punishments, an invisible weapon that Richard wielded with the precision of a surgeon. The truth was, our house on Fifth Avenue was a prison long before this one. A gilded prison with marble walls and gardens that bloomed with a painfully ordered beauty. Richard was both the architect and the jailer. And his tyranny was the most refined of all, a silent tyranny. His control began so subtly, disguised as care and devotion, that it took me years to recognize the bars. I remember a charity dinner, one of the first of our marriage. I dared to disagree with one of his business partners on politics. It wasn't a confrontation, it was an opinion. The room wasn't silent, but the look Richard gave me over the top of his crystal glass was enough to chill my blood. Later, at home, he didn't shout. It was worse. He spent 3 entire days without saying a single word to me. He was present, reading the newspaper next to me at breakfast, sleeping in the same bed, but I was invisible. It was as if my existence depended on his approval. The punishment for my crime, having a voice of my own, was being erased. That was his method. He edited my life, cutting out the friends he considered a bad influence, the colors of clothing he found vulgar. He monitored my phone calls, questioned every expense, not with anger, but with a paternalistic concern that made me feel ungrateful for wanting privacy. Every extravagant gift was a new golden chain. Every public compliment, a reminder of my role. The loneliness I felt in those opulent halls, with the suffocating scent of the white lilies he insisted on having, was deeper and colder than any loneliness I felt in this cell. Here, at least, the loneliness is honest. It doesn't wear an Armani suit or disguise itself as protective love. Then you were born, my little lily, and the entire universe reconfigured itself around you. Holding you in my arms for the first time was the only true miracle of my life. You were a miniature sun, a burst of warmth and light that began to melt the glaciers that had formed around my heart. Suddenly, Richard's approval, his silence, our immaculate home, all of it lost its significance. My world, which had previously revolved around his controlling orbit, now had a new center of gravity, you. It was because of you that I began to fight, not openly, but in small acts of silent rebellion. I created a secret email account to communicate with my sister. I began reading poetry books he considered frivolous, hiding them under my bed. I began writing a journal, rediscovering my own voice, word by word. One night, he nearly caught me. He walked into our room unexpectedly while I was writing. I slammed the journal shut, my heart leaping into my throat. He looked at me, at the book in my hands, and a cold smile touched his lips. "Writing down your secrets, my dear?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I hope it's nothing that can be misinterpreted." It was a veiled threat, the first seed of a plan I hadn't yet known. He saw that my love for you was a force he couldn't control, and it was that force that frightened him deeply. The discovery happened on a rainy afternoon. The rain beat against the library windows, the sound isolating us from the rest of the world. I was looking for an old photo album, wanting to show you a picture of your grandmother. It was chance, or perhaps fate, that made me stumble upon a bookshelf that seemed a little loose. Behind a row of leather-bound first editions, works Richard bought to impress, not to read, was the cold metal door of a small safe I had never seen. My intuition screamed. The code, ironically, was his birthday. The door opened without a sound. Inside, there were no jewelry or money. There was only one object, a diary. A black leather volume with his initials, RHV, engraved in gold. With each page I turned, my reality was ripped away. It was an instruction manual for my destruction. There were code-named entries. Entry 247. If G ever mentions divorce, initiate the Nightingale Protocol. The framework must be airtight. Leverage therapy sessions on PPD. The child is key. The betrayal was so absolute it stole my breath. The man I'd shared a bed with for a decade was a complete stranger. A monster. Our home wasn't a prison, it was a death trap. And I had my foot on the trigger. He found me like this, sitting on the library floor, my back against a bookshelf, the diary open in my lap, like a profane sacred text. The sound of his office door opening didn't startle me. I was beyond fear, in a state of icy, terrifying clarity. He stopped in the doorway, his silhouette silhouetted against the hallway light. And for the first time in 10 years, the mask of charming, attentive husband fell completely. His face was blank, his eyes like shards of ice. There was no shock, no surprise, no denial, only a cold recognition. "You should never have found this," was all he said. His voice was calm, controlled, and that absence of anger was infinitely more terrifying than any shout. His calm was the confirmation of everything. It was the signature at the end of that manifesto of hatred. The silence that settled between us was thick, heavy with the weight of years of lies. In that moment, I knew my life, the life I knew, was over. The question was what new life, or what new death, would begin next. He walked toward me, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. His intention was clear. He wanted the diary. Instinctively, I stood, clutching the book to my chest like a shield. It was the only proof of my sanity, the only weapon I had against the narrative he had written for me. "You will not take my daughter from me," I whispered, my voice a trembling edge of defiance I hadn't known I possessed. He stopped inches from me, close enough for me to smell the expensive scent of his cologne, a fragrance that once brought me comfort and now made me nauseous. A thin, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Our daughter," he corrected, the word "our" sounding like a claim of possession. "And I would never take her from you, Genevieve. I would just make sure you never saw her again. There's a difference." His confession was so calm, so brazen, it took my breath away. "It's all there, isn't it?" I continued, my voice gaining a strength that came from pure desperation. "The therapy, the depression, everything." He tilted his head, like a scientist observing a specimen. "You've always been so emotional, darling. So fragile. No one would have trouble believing it. A jury would see an unstable woman who finally broke. I would be the martyr. And Lily? She would be protected from you." The fight that followed was not a violent, messy brawl. It was a desperate, silent struggle for that black leather object. He grabbed my arm. I twisted. He tried to snatch the book from my hands. I gripped it tighter. I pushed him away, stumbling backward over the edge of a Persian rug. He lost his balance, his arms flailing in the air for a second that felt like an eternity. Then, he fell. There was a hollow, sickening thud as his head hit the solid oak corner of his desk. And suddenly, everything stopped. The only sound in the room was my labored breathing and the rain beating against the glass. The silence that followed was the deepest and most terrifying of all. A definitive silence. I stood there, paralyzed, the diary still pressed against my chest, staring at the man who had plotted my demise, now motionless on the floor of his immaculate library. Adrenaline blurred everything, but my mind, in an act of survival, became strangely clear. The diary. This book in my hands was my death sentence and my only hope. No one would believe me. But maybe, just maybe, they would believe him. My gaze fixed on his desk. Beside the lamp was another notebook, a plain covered notebook where he jotted down thoughts about the stock market. In an act of pure, irrational instinct, I switched the two. Hands shaking, I placed the notebook on the floor, inches from his body. I hid the leather journal under a cushion on the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. Only then, with the exchange made, did my mind allow me to feel the panic. I picked up the phone and dialed 911. When the first police officers entered, their heavy boots soiling the carpets, I was sitting in an armchair, shaking uncontrollably. I pointed to the notebook. He was writing. We argued. He fell, I stammered, my story sounding incoherent even to me. They saw what they were trained to see: the rich, hysterical wife, the dead billionaire husband, the scene straight out of a movie. The notebook was collected as the murder weapon, the supposed object of our dispute. They leafed through it dismissively, seeing only numbers and graphs. It was perfect. My desperate lie had worked, but it had trapped me even further. As a swarm of forensic experts descended on my house, I was allowed to make a call. I called my sister. "Come now," I said, my voice an urgent whisper. "I need you." When she arrived, amid the chaos, I managed to pass her the real diary, hidden inside a magazine. "Guard this with your life," I whispered, our eyes meeting in a pact of desperation and trust. "Don't let anyone know you have it." When they finally took me away, they covered my head with a coat, but not before I saw the flashing cameras. The media vultures had already arrived. In that short walk from my front door to the police car, I stopped being Genevieve. I became the Black Widow of Fifth Avenue. As I sat in the back seat, watching the lights of my house grow dimmer, a cold certainty settled in my heart. Richard had won. Even in death, his plan had worked. Arriving at Bedford Hills Correctional Institution was my forced plunge into an ocean of despair. The admission process was a lesson in dehumanization, designed to strip you of every layer of your identity until all that remained was an empty, obedient shell. They took away my designer clothes, my engagement ring, the necklace with her first baby tooth, Lily, which I wore hidden. Each object removed was a small loss, an amputation of my former life. Then came the search, cold and impersonal, a stranger's hands roaming my body with a clinical indifference that was more violent than any assault. The final blow was when they handed me my uniform, a rough cotton jumpsuit, a faded orange that seemed to suck all the light and color from the room. Donning that uniform was like donning the skin of my guilt, accepting the identity they had assigned me. The noise in the cell block was a constant cacophony, an assault on the senses. The metallic echo of slamming doors, the screams that erupted without warning, the overlapping conversations that formed an indistinguishable hum, the sound of a guard's radio crackling in a corner. It was a melodyless noise, the sound of contained chaos. But when my cell door closed for the first time, I encountered a new kind of silence. A claustrophobic silence, the sound of being buried alive. The four concrete walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thin. I sat on the thin bunk, the plastic mattress creaking under my weight, and looked at my hands. They were no longer the hands of Genevieve, the woman who organized charity events and helped you build Lego castles. They were the hands of inmate 734, stripped of rings, of varnish, on purpose. In that moment, the enormity of my situation hit me, not like a wave, but like the slow, crushing weight of a tectonic plate. Richard's betrayal had not only cost me my freedom, had cost me my name, my history, my very essence. The first few nights were the worst. The darkness was never complete. A cold, pale security light filtered through the bars, casting shadows that danced on the walls like ghosts. Time became my torturer. Each minute stretched into an eternity, and each hour was a small death. I lay with my eyes open, listening to the sounds of the prison drift off to sleep. The muffled cries from other cells, the whispers that traveled the corridors like secrets, the rhythmic footsteps of the night guards. It was in these moments of forced stillness that my mind became my enemy. The memories of that night repeated in an endless loop, but it was the memories of you, Lily, that broke me. Your smiling face, the sound of your laughter, the smell of your hair. Each memory was a knife twisting in the wound of my loss. I prayed for a miracle, not for release, but simply for the relief of oblivion, for the gift of a single night of dreamless sleep. But my faith was a fragile thing, a flickering flame in a gale, and sleep was a luxury this new life didn't afford me. Routine is both anchor and tether in this suspended existence. It's what keeps you from going completely mad, but it's also what reminds you, every second, that your life no longer belongs to you. The shrill sound of the bell at 6 a.m. is the beginning of another day, identical to the last. The countdown, standing in front of the cell as a guard passes, his gaze sweeping over us without really seeing us, only confirming that the bodies are still where they should be. I was assigned to the laundry room, a humid, noisy hellhole in the prison basement, where the smell of bleach and sweat clings to your skin and hair and never leaves. I spent 8 hours a day folding sheets and uniforms, my hands turning red and cracked from the chemicals. The repetitive movements, the crushing monotony, were a kind of anesthesia. They allowed me to shut off my mind, retreat to a place inside myself where memories and fear couldn't reach me. It was in the laundry room that I met Maria, a middle-aged woman serving a life sentence for a crime she committed at 19. She had spent more time inside prison than outside. Her eyes held a weary wisdom, the wisdom of someone who has seen all forms of hope born and die. It was she who taught me the unwritten rules, the invisible code that governs this microcosm. "Don't look anyone in the eye for too long," she told me one day, her voice low amid the noise of the machines. "Don't talk about your life out there. No one cares about your ghosts. Everyone here has their own." In this ecosystem, attention was dangerous, and anonymity was a form of armor. Justice here was nothing like what happened in a courtroom. It was immediate, often brutal, and governed by complex hierarchies. There were prison families, and our wing leader, a woman they called Rocha, commanded access to the public phone. I tried to call my sister once during the first week. Rocha and her followers blocked my path. "The line has a price, little princess," she said, the contempt in her voice dripping like venom. "And you have nothing to pay." Maria pulled me aside later. "Here, currency isn't money. It's favor, it's information, it's respect. And you haven't earned any of the three yet. Be careful." Hope is the most dangerous thing in this prison. Hopelessness is a dark piece. You grow accustomed to it like a chronic illness, stop fighting, and accept the pain as part of you. But hope is torture. I decided that my survival would depend not on the hope of getting out, but on finding a purpose to stay. And my purpose, my sole reason for being, was you, Lily. My mission was not to fight for my future, but to preserve the truth of your past. The prison library became my sanctuary. It was a small space with shelves filled with donated books, but it was the only place where the noise of the cell block faded to a distant murmur. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, was a quiet older woman, a volunteer who came twice a week. She never asked me questions. Instead, she gave me books. And one day, discreetly, she left a small pad of paper and a worn pen on my desk. He didn't say a word, just a curt nod. In that gesture, she didn't just give me paper and ink, she gave me back my voice. It was my first miracle. That night, in my cell, after countdown and lights out, I began to write. Under the thin blanket, with the small hallway light serving as a guide, the first letter to you, Lily, was born. Words poured out of me, a torrent of pain, anger, and love. Writing became my form of prayer, my resistance. But the danger was real. One night, the alarm blared. A surprise search. Guards stormed into our cell. My heart froze. The letters, dozens of them, lay beneath my thin mattress. As a guard, A woman with a hard, expressionless face tore apart my bed. Maria, with eerie calm, tripped and dropped her box of belongings, letters, photos, a bar of soap, scattering everything across the floor. "You clumsy girl!" the guard shouted, irritated by the confusion. In that brief moment of distraction, I managed to slip the bundle of letters into a hole-punched hardcover book Mrs. Gable had given me, a silent gift whose usefulness I only understood in that second. The guard passed by the book without a second glance. That night, the ticking of my heart was louder than any clock. I owed my life, my sanity, to Maria. The pile of letters grew, now better hidden. Protecting that archive of truth became my sole and sacred duty. My relationship with Mrs. Gable evolved in a language of silence and books. She began leaving me biographies of women who survived incredible ordeals, stories of wrongful convictions overturned after decades. They were messages in a bottle, beacons of light flickering in the distance. Her silent belief began to rekindle my own faith, not in a divine miracle, but in the possibility of a human miracle, born of courage and compassion. The moment that changed everything came on a gray Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Gable handed me a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. When I opened it later in my cell, a small, tiny, folded piece of paper fell into my lap. My heart stopped. The note contained only one sentence, written in elegant handwriting. "I know someone who listens to the forgotten stories. He visits next Tuesday." I spent the next few days in a state of feverish anxiety. I transcribed a single page from Richard's diary, the entry where he detailed, with psychopathic clarity, how he planned to use my therapy against me. I folded that piece of paper over and over again, until it became a small square, dense with the weight of my future. The ticking of fate was about to sound. The library, that Tuesday, felt like a stage. The air was thick with a tension only I could feel. Every creak of a chair, every turn of a page sounded like thunder. I sat at a table in the corner, a book open in front of me, but the words were just black blurs. My attention was riveted to the door. "Mrs. Gable greeted me with her usual nod, but I saw a glint of anxiety in her eyes that betrayed her outward calm. She placed an extra book on my desk without a word. Courage was the title. Then he walked in. He was older than I'd imagined, maybe in his 60s, with graying hair and a face lined with weariness and cynicism, as if he'd heard every lie the world had to offer. But his eyes, behind thick-rimmed glasses, were bright, intelligent, and attentive. His name was David Horowitz, a name that meant nothing to me. He was interviewing another inmate, a woman named Sarah, for a story about prison education programs. My heart was pounding wildly, a drum beating the alarm. The small square of paper in my hand, hidden in the sleeve of my uniform, felt like it was burning. A guard stood near the door, his gaze idly roaming the room, making my mission nearly impossible. The ticking of the clock on the wall was a countdown to my failure. Time was running out. David's interview with Sarah was ending. He was packing his things, his notebook, his pen. Panic began to rise in my throat. I looked at Mrs. Gable, a silent plea in my eyes. She understood. With a subtle mastery I would forever admire, she walked toward David's desk with her cart of books. Just as the guard looked away, distracted by a noise in the hallway, Mrs. Gable accidentally knocked a stack of books off the cart. The sharp thud made the guard turn his head. David glanced in her direction, irritated by the interruption. It was now or never. I stood, blood pounding in my ears. I approached his desk, pretending to help Mrs. Gable. As I bent down to pick up a book, I grabbed another from his desk, a poetry book. "I think you'll like this one," I murmured, my voice barely audible, handing him the book that was already his. The small square of paper was hidden in my palm, and I pressed it into his hand with the book. The transaction lasted less than 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Our fingers touched, and for an instant, our eyes met over the tops of his glasses. In that brief moment of contact, I saw something more than curiosity. I saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even compassion. He closed his hand over the paper, a barely perceptible movement, and gave me a slight nod before returning his attention to Mrs. Gable. "Thank you," he said, his voice neutral. "I'll take a look." Returning to the cell block was surreal. I had just committed the most reckless and dangerous act of my prison life. Anxiety was a fire burning in my chest. 2 long, agonizing weeks had passed. 14 days in which time seemed to stand still, and each sunrise was just another reminder of my impending failure. I began to think I had been forgotten, that my note had been thrown away, dismissed as the delusion of yet another inmate claiming innocence. The hope that had sustained me began to sour, turning into despair. It was then that my attorney, a young, overworked man I barely saw, requested an urgent meeting. His usually disinterested demeanor had changed. There was a nervous excitement in his eyes. "I don't know what's going on, Genevieve," he said, leaning across the metal table that separated us. "But things are moving. The New York Times is asking questions about Richard's case. A reporter named Horowitz is digging things up. He's spoken to former associates, ex-girlfriends. Patterns of coercive control, of financial irregularities are emerging. Someone gave them a very, very specific tip. For the first time in years, I cried. Not tears of sadness or anger, but of relief so overwhelming it tore me apart. The news spread through the prison like wildfire. One day, one of the newer guards mentioned seeing a picture of me in an article online. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. The other inmates looked at me differently, a mixture of awe, respect, and in some cases, venom. Maria's prophecy had come true. Hope had become a target. Rosha cornered me near the washing machines. "You think you're better than us now? With your fancy reporter?" she hissed, her body blocking my path. "Do you think you'll just walk out of here and forget about us?" Before I could respond, Maria appeared beside me, silent as a shadow. She said nothing to Rocha, just stood there, her calm, unwavering presence a wall. Rocha hesitated, looked from me to Maria, and retreated with a snort of contempt. The change, when it came, was an earthquake. David Horowitz's article was the first crack in the dam. The headline was a sober, incisive question: a dead husband's diary, narrative suicide, or a black widow's alibi. The article didn't declare me innocent. Instead, it meticulously exposed Richard's patterns of control. The public narrative, once so solid against me, began to crack. The legal turning point came when my sister, now protected by the public investigation, finally handed the original diary over to my lawyers. "It's authentic, Genevieve," my lawyer said in a call, his voice trembling with excitement. "The handwriting, the age of the ink, it's his voice from the grave, confessing a conspiracy." Justice, once a desperate prayer, became a mechanism that had finally been geared in the right direction. I was not present in court on the day of my exoneration. My presence was considered too inflammatory. I experienced that climactic moment through a phone call, sitting in the uncomfortable chair in the prison warden's office. I remember the dry click of the speakerphone activating, the electric hum of silence on the line before my lawyer's voice filled the room. He narrated events like a radio announcer describing a historic event. The climax was not the testimony of a surprise witness, but the silence that fell over the courtroom as he read aloud passages from Richard's diary. His voice, calm and steady, brought my late husband's cold, calculating words to life. I listened over the phone as his plan to destroy me, his methodical cruelty, was finally exposed. In that moment, Richard ceased to be the idealized victim and became what he truly was, a monster. His house of lies, which he had so carefully built, crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. The most powerful sound in the courtroom that day wasn't the prosecution's or defense's arguments. It was the sound of a dead man's words destroying his own reputation and freeing the woman he'd tried to bury. When the judge uttered the word exonerated, I expected to feel a burst of joy, an overwhelming relief. Instead, what I felt was a deep, heavy silence descending upon me. It was as if an internal structure I'd held together with sheer willpower for years suddenly dissolved. My body gave way, and I burst into tears, not sobs of joy, but with the dry, painful sound of a drought breaking. The warden, a woman who always maintained a professional distance, placed a hand on my shoulder. It was the first human touch of compassion I'd received from an authority figure in years. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. The process of liberation was surreal. Returning the orange uniform, which had become my second skin, was like shedding a ghost. Signing the papers, receiving my personal belongings in a cardboard box, fragments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. On my way out, I passed Maria in the hallway. She didn't smile, but gave me a slow, meaningful nod. "Go live for all of us," she said, her voice a whisper. The final walk down the hallway felt longer than ever. Each step echoed with the memories of the steps I'd taken on that same floor in despair. The sound of each gate unlocking was like a note rising in a musical scale, building to a crescendo. And then the final door opened. Sunlight hit me with a physical force, blinding me. The air, filled with the smell of wet grass and exhaust, filled my lungs, an air so rich and complex it made me dizzy. The sound of traffic, the chirping of birds, the distant voices of people going about their normal lives, it was an overwhelming symphony. My sister was there, waiting, and beside her, you were, Lily. My freedom wasn't an abstract idea. I had your face. Our first embrace wasn't how I'd rehearsed it in my mind a million times. You were taller, almost a girl, no longer the small child of my memories. There was a shyness in your eyes, a hesitation in your touch. The stolen time was a chasm between us, a space filled with unasked questions and the pain of an absence I could never fully repair. I held you in my arms, breathing in the scent of your hair, and felt the sharp pain of my loss in a way not even prison could inflict. In that moment, I understood that true freedom wasn't just walking out those gates. It was the long, patient journey of crossing that abyss, of rebuilding our emotional home from the ruins. It was the work of showing you, not just telling you, that my love had survived intact, that it had been my only fuel, my only unshakable faith. People often ask me if I've forgiven Richard. The question presupposes that forgiveness is a gift given to another, an act of absolution. But I learned that true forgiveness is an act of self-preservation. It's not about absolving the monster. It's about not allowing its ghost to continue haunting your home. The hardest work was forgiving myself. Forgiving the young woman who didn't see the danger signs, who mistook control for care, who believed in a fairy tale because she desperately wanted it to be true. This process of forgiveness was my true and final redemption. It was the act of reclaiming my name, not as the socialite, nor as the inmate. Simply as Genevieve, a mother, a survivor, a woman who fell into the deepest darkness and found her way back, not because she was special, but because she clung to the only truth that mattered: love for you. Today, we live in a small house with an imperfect, wild garden. The flowers grow where they will, and there are weeds that I let stay because sometimes they too have a stubborn beauty. It is our home, a place built not on marble and silence, but on conversation, laughter, and the acceptance of life's disorder. Sometimes I read you my prison letters. They are the map of our history, the testimony of how we lost ourselves and found ourselves again. Freedom isn't the absence of bars. It's the presence of truth. It's looking at your daughter and, in her eyes, finally finding your way home. In the end, I learned that freedom isn't about walking out a gate. It's about saying my name again in full voice and seeing in the eyes of those I love that the truth has stood firm. When the prison within me fell silent, I understood. Silence can also cry out for justice, and each letter I wrote was a brick in my house, not of marble, but of belonging. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs courage today. Comment below, which part resonated most deeply? What name do you need to reclaim? Yours, your faith, your home? I want to read your truth. And subscribe, click the bell. We're dedicated to giving voice to these stories that remind us that, even in the dark, the light doesn't ask for permission. It comes.